Gonzaga has yet to announce their finalized non-conference schedule, but that's not going to stop us from ranking every game on the calendar as the season draws near.
You are Locked On Zags, your daily podcast on the Gonzaga Bulldogs. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is going on, y'all? Welcome into the Locked On Zags podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I am your host and longtime Gonzaga podcaster, Andy Patton, here to bring you news and updates on all things Zag athletics. Today's episode of Locked On Zags is brought to you by Game Time. Folks, download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONCollege, and you will get $20 off your first purchase. Terms do apply. Well, we got 13 non-conference games coming up this season. At this point, we know the teams Gonzaga is going to play in the non-conference schedule. We know the conference slate as well, and we'll talk more about the conference, get you ready for the WCC as we get closer to the season. But for now, wanted to take an opportunity to just go through Gonzaga's non-conference schedule because it's a lot more competitive than it has been in years past. There's not an Eastern Oregon on the calendar this year. There's not a non-D1 program. And while I think that Gonzaga gets unfairly criticized for having a handful of bye games because every team in college basketball has a handful of bye games every single year, this year, we'll talk about this in the final segment, the teams that Gonzaga has bought games against, the teams that they're playing at the McCarthy Athletic Center, most of them won 20 games last year. Most of them were pretty good mid-major programs. Gonzaga's not playing a bunch of teams from the SWAC conference, a bunch of teams that were, in the bottom 25 among all 360 Division I college basketball programs. They're not doing that this year. And I think it's worth celebrating and talking about these teams that maybe don't have a lot of brand recognition, not a lot of notoriety, that I think more casual fans are going to lump, a UMass Lowell or a Bucknell or Nicholls State into, oh, that's just like the same as all those other teams that Gonzaga played. And these teams are better than a lot of the teams Gonzaga has played in the past. And I think that's a conscious effort by Mark Few and the Zags to make sure that even the games that, aren't against the high profile programs, not every non-conference game is going to be a marquee opponent, but even those other ones, you want to be able to play teams that are really going to challenge you. And I think this schedule has set Gonzaga up accordingly. However, we're going to start by ranking from the very top, ranking all 13 of Gonzaga's non-conference games. And number one, there's arguably a debate you could have made here, but I just don't know how you could pick any game other than December 14th, when Gonzaga flies across the country to play at the Madison Square Garden against the defending back-to-back national champion UConn Huskies. Yes, Gonzaga has more history with the Baylor Bears. They have more history with the UCLA Bruins. They got more history even with Kentucky Wildcats. But this game is one of the best non-conference college basketball games in the entire country this upcoming season. There is absolutely no debate. It is a return of a pseudo home-and-home series that Gonzaga scheduled with UConn prior to last season. They hosted UConn at the Climate Pledge Arena last year in Seattle, lost that game. Donovan Clingan was a workhorse for the UConn Huskies against Gonzaga in that one. It was a tough game. I think the Zags ended up losing by about 13, and I'm not sure it even felt that close at times, but Gonzaga fought back and kind of hung around in that game, but UConn put them away early and kind of just maintained a victory, something that they've done a whole heck of a lot in the last couple of years in the Dan Hurley era. There's more to this game than just the fact that Gonzaga has played UConn in each of the last couple of years, lost to them in the NCAA tournament a few years ago. I think a big part of what makes this game extra appealing for Gonzaga, other than wanting to get revenge on UConn for beating them the last 2 years, is the fact that Aiden Mahaney, one of the better rivals that Gonzaga's had. The St. Mary's has always been a rival for Gonzaga, and they've always had players, but Aiden Mahaney really kind of rose to a villain level pretty early in his St. Mary's career, and now has kind of arguably made himself a villain of even St. Mary's fans, having hit the transfer portal after the season, going over to UConn to play for the Huskies. He's going to be a villain over there. I have said on the show, and I'm willing to eat my words if I'm wrong here, but I'm not super confident in how his skill set translates to Dan Hurley's offense. He's a talented player. I'm not sure how it's going to work over there. We'll get a good picture of it. By the time this game happens, they'll have played, I think, 5 or 6 games, something like that, maybe even more by the time that game rolls around. So it'll be a good opportunity for Gonzaga to once again get a crack at Aiden Haney, who had to leave St. Mary's to get a better chance of beating Gonzaga in that one. Liam McNeely, a freshman for UConn, is also a former Gonzaga target. So there's a few different storylines that are going to come out of that matchup, which should be one, again, like I said, one of the most exciting games in all of college basketball this upcoming season. Number 2 on our list is a just announced game, Gonzaga Baylor. We knew it was happening. We had heard rumors that it was going to happen November 6th in Mexico City. We had heard rumors that it was going to happen sometime in the first week of the season and that Las Vegas was the potential destination. Now, per a report from Jeff Goodman of the Field of 68, we are hearing this game is going to take place on November 4th, the very first day of the college basketball season. The game will be played at the Spokane Arena. Huge shout out to Scott Drew for being willing to come to Spokane to play this game against Gonzaga in the first week, the first day of the season. This is going to be an incredible matchup. Gonzaga rarely plays huge, big-time games this early in the season. Very few college basketball teams do. So to see this matchup come up is fantastic. It is part of what is going to be a 3-year home-and-home series, or 3-year series. The next 2 games will be at more traditional neutral sites. I'm wondering if they're going to attempt to make the Mexico City game happen in a future season. Maybe Las Vegas will be back in the mix. We know Gonzaga and Baylor have played at the Sanford Pentagon, so maybe they'll make that happen as well. But what an incredible matchup this is going to be, November 4th, between 2 elite college basketball programs. There's a pretty obvious reasons why Gonzaga and Baylor would be such an appealing non-conference matchup. It's a reunion, or a rematch, I should say, of the 2021 national championship game, which we don't like to remember if we don't have to, but obviously that is a huge part of why this game is extra fun. Baylor's going to be a top 10 team next year, probably going to be a top 5 team. Gonzaga and Baylor, I would not be shocked at all if Gonzaga and Baylor are right next to each other in the AP poll when this game happens. There's a very good chance that they're within a spot of each other in the standings. Baylor brings in Norchad Omier from Miami, a guy who's averaged a double-double all 4 years he's been in college. They bring in Jeremy Roach, a 3-year starter at Duke at the point guard position. They got a top freshman coming in, VJ Edgecombe. That dude is an absolute athlete, an absolute star. He's going to be one of the first players picked in the NBA draft. This is a really good Baylor team, and they're going to match up really well with Gonzaga. And I think this is going to be an incredibly exciting game, especially early in the season, where Gonzaga gets a bit of an advantage having more continuity on their roster. Baylor's going to have at least 3 new starters, potentially 4 new starters. And for a game that's going to take place a few days into the season, that could be an advantage for Gonzaga. But Scott Drew's a very good coach, so don't be surprised if that team looks really ready to go, even with very little continuity and not a lot of time playing together. And then our third on our ranking of Gonzaga's non-conference schedule is the Kentucky Wildcats at Climate Pledge Arena. That game is on December 7th. Completely new roster. Not a single player who was on Kentucky's roster last year is back. And that includes coach John Calipari, who is, of course, now over at Arkansas, replacing Eric Musselman, who went to USC, replacing Andy Enfield, who went to SMU. As a whole coaching carousel. Now BYU, former BYU coach Mark Pope goes to Kentucky. He's familiar with Mark Few. He's one of the few WCC coaches to really ever actually make an impact against Mark Few and Gonzaga. It doesn't happen very often. Mark Pope has coached well enough to beat Gonzaga with rosters that weren't as talented as Gonzaga. I think that's still true this year. I don't think Kentucky's roster is as talented as Gonzaga's. And certainly, even if you thought the rosters were comparable, the fact that Gonzaga has a roster where 7 of their 8 leading scorers are back, and Kentucky has mostly guys who have never played together, gives Gonzaga an advantage. I think they're going to win this game, but I think Kentucky, I have said this on the show and I'll say it again, I think that this is the kind of game that's going to age well for Gonzaga. You beat this team in December when they're still kind of figuring everything out. By the time, February, March rolls around, I think that's going to be a win that looks good for the Zags. No guarantee they're going to win it. I don't want to promise that, but I think it's setting itself up well to be an advantageous game for the Zags. In terms of, obviously, the Mark Pope connection is already a big part of this, but Kerr Kriisa, former Arizona and West Virginia guard, and Lamont Butler, former San Diego State guard, are both with the Cats, 2 familiar faces that Zags fans will see at that game in Seattle on December 7th. Well, folks, a rematch with Mick Cronin and Dominic Harris is coming up for Gonzaga later in the offseason or in the non-conference slate. They also have a trio of excellent games in the Bahamas. They're all next up in our rankings, and we're going to talk about them in just a second. Right after I tell you about today's sponsor, FanDuel. You've heard us talk a lot about FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, and usually we're filling you in on a boost or a bonus offer from FanDuel. Today we have something a little bit different. Now through September 22nd, all FanDuel customers can bet $5 and get a 3-week free trial of NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. Then with the YouTube TV base plan, you'll be able to watch every regular season Sunday afternoon out-of-market game. All you need is a Google account and a current form of payment, and you can cancel anytime. Right now, the Zags still at plus 2,000 odds to win the 2025 National Championship. If you're a believer, you want to toss $5 down and get 3 free weeks of NFL Sunday Ticket, just join me by visiting FanDuel.com/lockedon to download America's #1 sportsbook today. Today's episode of Locked On Zags is also brought to you by Game Time. Going to live events is the absolute best. Whether it's sports, music, theater, comedy, or more. And look, college sports are back. It's football season, which means it's very, very close to being basketball season, and I am looking forward to making new memories this college sports season. And great news, when you're getting tickets for this year, Game Time has a new feature called Game Time Picks that makes getting tickets for your favorite live events even easier. Game Time Picks filters out the fluff to show you only incredible deals on great seats so you don't have to waste time searching through thousands of tickets. And speaking of that matchup in Seattle, battle in Seattle tickets for Gonzaga versus Kentucky, they're $58 a pop on Game Time right now for the cheapest tickets. You can also find the super deal, 2 tickets, $140 a piece, just a few rows up on the baseline. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. Those 2 $58 tickets, you get them combined for under $100 if you use promo code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off at Game Time. Terms do apply. Download the Game Time app today. Last-minute tickets, lowest prices, guaranteed. All right, folks, moving on here as we are ranking Gonzaga's non-conference schedule. When we found out UMass Lowell has been added to the schedule, that gives us 13 games in the non-conference slate. And we're going to talk about 3 of them right now because it was kind of difficult to figure out where to rank the battle for Atlantis because we know that Gonzaga is going to play 3 games in the Bahamas in this multi-team event or MTE, and we only know one of the opponents officially. If we were just ranking West Virginia, who is Gonzaga's first opponent in the battle for Atlantis, they would be behind the next 2 games on our list. Maybe the next 3 games on our list. I didn't have to compare them straight across to Arizona State, but I had to be kind of close right there. But I ended up putting the battle for Atlantis here at the top of segment 2 because it's not just West Virginia. It's West Virginia and then either Indiana or Louisville. And then after that, it's one of the following 4 teams: Davidson, Oklahoma, Providence, or, and this is the big hinge, Arizona. Gonzaga versus Arizona is the #1 non-conference game of the year for Gonzaga if it happens. Above UConn, above Baylor, because of the incredible matchup that would create between Mark Few's team and Tommy Lloyd's team. Not only that, it would be a championship game in one of the most marquee premier multi-team events in college basketball history. Gonzaga, Arizona championship game, November 29th, if it were to happen. I think you could make a strong argument that it would be the non-conference game of the season. And I think Gonzaga UConn is clearly on that list, but this game would definitely be a part of that conversation as well. We know West Virginia on November 27th. New head coach there, Darian DeVries, takes over, brought his son along with him, Tucker DeVries. Tucker DeVries is not a Joe Few or Andrew Hurley type player who just comes off the bench. Tucker DeVries scored 21.5 points per game last year at Drake, was one of the premier scoring guards in the country. He's going to do the same stuff at West Virginia. He's going to be a problem for Mark Few and the Zags to have to solve defensively, assuming they win that game, which I think that they will. I think Darian DeVries is a good coach, but I don't think West Virginia is going to turn things around super quickly this upcoming season. They'll end up playing either Indiana or Louisville. Indiana has Umar Ballo and Miles Rice from Washington State. They'd be a really fun matchup for Gonzaga to face off against an old player, to face off a team that I think is going to be pretty good this year. Louisville, similar to Kentucky, fully, completely new roster, replaced everybody. New coach Pat Kelsey comes over from Charleston, where he had back-to-back 30-win seasons. A lot of talented players on this Louisville roster. Cason Pryor, Ali Khalifa, two bigs that Gonzaga's familiar with. Corin Johnson from Washington, Chucky Hepburn from Wisconsin, Javon Hadley from Colorado, Terrence Edwards from James Madison, just a few of the players on that Louisville roster. Either one of those matchups would be really compelling and entertaining for Mark Few and the Zags. And then again, if you get that championship against Arizona, it's complete cake. Complete cake. What an incredible day November 29th could end up being. Nerve-wracking, very, very, very frightening day for Gonzaga fans leading up to that game, but it's going to be an absolute blast if they get it. And if they don't get Arizona, none of the other ones move the needle all that much. Davidson would obviously be the worst case scenario. I don't think that's going to happen. I mean, unless Davidson somehow wins all these games and Gonzaga plays them in a championship, you never know. I suppose it could happen. Seems unlikely. Providence or Oklahoma both feel like kind of bubble teams. They're going to be decent. They're both bubble teams last year who were both on the wrong side of the bubble. So I like Kim English, the coach for Providence. I think that's a team that's going to be pretty good this year. I think they're going to be a little bit improved. I think Oklahoma is going to be probably about the same as where they were last year. But the only game out of this group here that really matters for Gonzaga is Arizona. So we got to hope that's the matchup that they end up getting. Next up on our list, and it's crazy, this is fifth in our non-conference rankings. That is Mick Cronin's UCLA Bruins, December 28th. That game will take place at the Intuit Dome just outside of Los Angeles. It is going to be the new home of the LA Clippers. For a long time, this game was going to be the first college basketball game played at the Intuit Dome, except that it is now part of a doubleheader. We are expecting that Gonzaga and UCLA will be the second game, because the first game is between Grand Canyon and San Diego. It'd be very surprising if that game happened after Gonzaga UCLA, which unfortunately means Gonzaga will not actually be the first team to play at the Intuit Dome, first college team, I should say, to play at the Intuit Dome. But that doesn't take away from the intrigue of this matchup. Gonzaga UCLA, an incredible amount of history dating back, of course, to the Adam Morrison game in 2006 in the NCAA tournament. You have the Jalen Suggs game in 2021, the incredible 37-foot bank shot to send Gonzaga to that national championship against Baylor. You have the Julian Strother shot a few years ago that led to Gonzaga playing UConn in the Elite Eight. Just a ton of intrigue between these two teams, a ton of history. Mick Cronin has been a thorn in Gonzaga's side. Gonzaga has gotten the best of him, but he plays this slow down style that can really grind out some hideous basketball games. Dom Harris is now with UCLA, former Gonzaga guard who played last year at LMU, averaged about 14 points a game, transferred to UCLA, has got 2 years of eligibility left. So Zags will get another chance to play Dom. He played them once last year, did not have a good game when Gonzaga absolutely boat raced LMU in that one. He was injured for the second time for that matchup, but now he'll get a chance at redemption for this UCLA team against Gonzaga. It should be a really, really fun game. I think UCLA is going to end up being a top 25 team, so it'll be a nice matchup for them. Two more here before we move on to the final segment with our four kind of bye games. Next up, sixth on the list, November 18th. Gonzaga is going down to San Diego, the Viejas Arena, to take on the Aztecs of San Diego State. It's the return of a home and home. Last year, Gonzaga lost at home to San Diego State. One of the few non-conference teams that comes into the kennel and can win. They did it a long time ago when Kawhi Leonard was a student at San Diego State. They did it last year as well. One of the more frustrating games for Gonzaga during the season last year. San Diego State's a great team. I think they're going to be down this year. They lose Jaden Ledee. They lose Darion Trammell, Micah Parrish, Lamont Butler. A handful of other guys are gone. They added some players in the portal, but nobody who moves the needle quite in the same way as the guys that they lost. So I think Brian Dutcher's team is going to be down a little bit, but they're still going to be good. And this could be a future conference opponent. And we have talked about the Gonzaga to the Pac-12 and whether that is a realistic thing, but San Diego State is going to be a member of the Pac-12. That's no longer a rumor. That is a fact. It is going to happen in 2026. And so perhaps, and we'll have more conversations about conference realignment, but perhaps that is another element of this game to add some intrigue. And then last here, seventh on our list, Gonzaga's game, November 10th, Arizona State coming to the McCarthy Athletic Center, the first home game on this list, Bobby Hurley's team. And it's the first ever matchup between Gonzaga and Arizona State. That shocked me when I first learned that. Just feels like two good West Coast basketball programs should have played each other by now, but Arizona State has been inconsistent. They've been good. They've also been not so good at times. But this is a power conference team. This is a Big 12 opponent that we have 7th on our list, which is just a testament to how strong Gonzaga's non-conference schedule is. Mark Few taking on both of the Hurleys this offseason, Danny on December 14th, and of course, Bobby here a month before that on November 10th. Arizona State added top prospect Jaden Quintance, one of the highest rated players in this recruiting class. He's got to be at college for 2 years because he's so young. He was a Kentucky commit who decommitted after Calipari left. Arizona State scooped him up. Very excited to see how this youngster looks, but I also think that for what is going to be probably his second college basketball game, I kind of think Graham Ike is going to just put this young man in a blender all game long, but it's still going to be fun to watch. And I'm excited that this is one of the early games for Gonzaga, is a good, not great, but good Arizona State team. Well, folks, like I said at the onset, even Gonzaga's bye games, even their mid-major opponents that they're playing at home, they're all better this year than we've seen in years past. And we got more on those matchups coming up in just a second. But first, folks, let's talk about our new sponsor, Roy. Hey, Zag fans, have you heard about Roy? It stands for Return on You, and it's a new platform that lets you, the fans, get involved in NIL like never before by making contributions directly to your favorite athletes. By supporting players directly, you can help shape rosters, retain talent, and keep your favorite athletes out of the transfer portal. NIL has changed the game for athletes, and Roy changes the NIL game for fans. Why use Roy? Well, you get exclusive content access. When fans contribute to a successful campaign, they receive access to exclusive content from the athlete, such as their announcement decision, behind-the-scenes footage, and other personal reflections. Download Roy for iOS or Android and enter referral code LOCKEDON, and you'll automatically be entered into a sweepstakes to win $5,000 cash. Visit joinroy.com for additional details. No purchase necessary, void where prohibited. Get off the sidelines and get into the NIL game with Roy. All right, folks, segment 3, closing out the show today with 4 more non-conference matchups for the Gonzaga Bulldogs here in our rankings. And look, I said it at the onset of the show, and I'm going to say it again here because I think it's important to acknowledge that some of these teams are not going to be names that are super familiar to casual or even diehard college basketball fans. There's not a lot of national conversation about UMass Lowell or Nicholls State or Bucknell. Long Beach State also, but there's more familiarity with Gonzaga fans at least. But here's the thing. While in our minds and in the minds of many fans, the difference between a program like UMass Lowell and, say, Mississippi Valley State or Jackson State or some of the other teams that Gonzaga has played in recent years may seem insignificant. Casual fans may not even seem different at all. They may be perceived as the same, of like, oh, these are just those bad teams that Gonzaga plays. And yeah, Gonzaga is probably going to blow all these teams out, or at least beat all 4 of these teams. But I think it's important to acknowledge, especially in the transfer portal era, we're just talking about how good these teams were last year. They're obviously going to be different this year. And at mid-major levels, teams have to overturn their rosters sometimes fairly significantly. But it was clear that Mark Few and Gonzaga made an intentional effort to choose by-game opponents that aren't going to be in the bottom 25 of the Division I rankings at KenPom. KenPom, there's 360 teams. Many of the teams Gonzaga has played in the past end up in the 330, 340 range at KenPom. None of these teams were anywhere close to that range last year. And I think that's important for us to acknowledge that it appears to have been a conscious effort by the staff to pick some better games for those kind of buy game, the buy game opponents that we know Gonzaga is going to play every year. So next up here, number 8 on our list is the most recent game added to the schedule, November 15th, UMass Lowell at the McCarthy Athletic Center. I'm going to give myself a little pat on the back. In a show last week or 2 weeks ago, I said when Gonzaga does add their final non-conference game, it's going to be a bye game at home between November 10th when they play Arizona State and November 18th when they play San Diego State. That ended up being true. Gonzaga is playing UMass Lowell at the Kennel on November 15th, so it is in the middle of that game. It is a bye game. It is a game at home at the McCarthy Athletic Center. But it is not, again, it's not to pick on Jackson State or Mississippi Valley State or some of those teams. UMass Lowell was 22-10 last year. UMass Lowell finished in KenPom 153rd. That's higher than a lot of teams in the WCC. This is a good team. It was last year where Gonzaga's non-conference schedule, every team was either a top 30 team at KenPom or they were outside of the top 229. I remember that. It was top 30 or bottom 200 or outside the top 229. And the only games in the middle were UW and Yale. Every other game was outside of those two ranges. Now, most of Gonzaga's bye games, one of them's 234th, and then one of them's 276th, and the other two are within that range. UMass Lowell finished 153rd at KenPom last year. Long Beach State finished 165th. So we're looking at teams that were better last year. UMass Lowell lost to Vermont in the America East Championship game. If they'd won that game, they'd have gone dancing. It would have been the first time in program history that they're making the NCAA tournament. This season was their first 20-win season in history. So it's not like they have a rich history of being particularly good. First time they won 20 games, but they're a program that is moving up and up. They've been Division I for I think 13, 14 seasons. They've had the same coach the whole time. Finally got them over that 20-win barrier, very close to getting them into the NCAA tournament. First matchup between the two schools. I'm excited for this one. Again, it's right in between the Arizona State and San Diego State games, so a little bit of a break for Gonzaga with this one, a chance to play a decent team at home that should help make this team a little bit better. November 20th, 2 days after they go down to San Diego to take on the Aztecs, they'll be back at home against the Long Beach State 49ers. Maybe they'll pick them up on the way back to Spokane for this one again. Long Beach State, 165th at KenPom last year, 21-15, and they did make the NCAA tournament. They weren't supposed to. In fact, their coach, Dan Monson, former Gonzaga head coach, had already been fired after the regular season before the start of the Big West Conference tournament. Long Beach State fired Dan Monson after, I think it has 17 years that he'd been there. No, not quite that long. It had been there for a very long time at Long Beach State. I think it was 17 years, actually. Regardless, after finding out he got fired, all he did was go ahead and lead the team to a Big West tournament championship, a 15 seed in the NCAA tournament, where he got to go face off against his old buddy Tommy Lloyd and Arizona. Mark Few and the Zags were also in that same bracket, so all three of those coaches got to hang out together. It was a really weird and strange situation for Dan Monson. Most people kind of thought that he was just going to ride off into the sunset, and instead he comes back home. He's going to coach. He's the head coach of the Eastern Washington Eagles. Mark Few and the Zags never played Long Beach State while Dan Monson was the head coach there. So if you're thinking, well, I hope that Gonzaga and Eastern Washington bring their series back, probably not, at least not while Dan's there as the head coach. So that's something to keep in mind, but very excited to see Gonzaga take on this Long Beach team. New coach, very new roster, so it's hard to project how good they're going to be this year. But again, this was a decent team last year that made the NCAA tournament. Next game, Nicholls State, December 18th. At, of course, the McCarthy Athletic Center. Nicholls State was 20-14 last year, 13-5 in the Southland. They did not make the NCAA tournament. The team from the Southland that did make the NCAA tournament was McNeese State, who Gonzaga obliterated in the first round of the NCAA tournament last year. Nicholls State finished 234th at KenPom. They have won 20 or more games every other year, dating back to 2017. So this is a pretty consistent program. Every other year, they win 20 or more games. The other years, they've been decent as well. So this is a decent team. Again, it's one of the most buy game type, it is a buy game, and it's one of the more kind of traditionally buy game type games that you're going to see on the schedule. But this is not a team as bad as many of the teams that Gonzaga typically plays. Now, they haven't gone to the NCAA tournament since 1998. So it's not like they're, a perennial mid-major darling or Cinderella or anything like that. But 4 seasons of 20 or more wins in the last last decade-ish. You could do a lot worse than that for Gonzaga and Nicholls State here. And then last, December 21st, right before the Christmas break, Gonzaga will host Bucknell, the Bison, coming in. They were 10-8 last year in the Patriot League, 14-19 overall, 276th at KenPom. I'm sure Gonzaga's future starting point guard, Braden Smith, is familiar with Bucknell, having faced them 2 years while he was at Colgate and the player of the year in that conference. Bucknell hasn't had a ton of recent success, but they did go dancing 4 times between 2011 and 2018. So they've been in the NCAA tournament semi-regularly in the last decade or so. Again, they had a winning record in the Patriot League. They won 14 games last year, but here's the thing that I kind of want to leave you with. The last stat that I'm going to use. Gonzaga's non-conference opponents last year, only 4 of them won less than 20 games. Every other team that Gonzaga's playing in the non-conference won 20 or more games last year. Of the 4 teams that did not win 20 or more games, 2 of them are in the Big 12, one of them's in the Big 10, and one of them here is Bucknell. So they're not playing mid-major teams that were bad. They're playing a Nichols State team that won 20 games, a Long Beach State team that won 21 games, a UMass Lowell team that won 22 games. And their non-20 win opponents are Bucknell, West Virginia, who they didn't choose to play, just happened to be the draw they got in that tournament, Arizona State, and UCLA. Got to laugh at UCLA being on that list, but they were not a good team last year. Obviously expected to be much better this year. So when you play 4 teams with 20 who won less than 20 games last year, and one of them is projected to be in the top 25, I think you're in a good spot knowing that you got a schedule that's going to be one of the most competitive non-conference schedules in all of college basketball this upcoming season. It's going to wrap it up for me today here on the Locked On Zags podcast. Folks, thank you so much for making the show your first listen or your first watch of the day. I'll be back with one more episode this week. We're going to continue our conversation talking about conference realignment, Gonzaga's viability for the Pac-12, what it means that Gonzaga and the Pac-12 are both using one of the same consulting firms. That's probably not nothing. We're going to talk about all of that later in the week. For now, though, I want to say thank you again for listening. And until next time, as always, go Zags.